It really was a lot easier to establish your reputation 25 years ago than it is now, because you have to have skills across such a wide range of stuff. The question about how do I get into the industry is not the same question that it used to be.
Hi everybody and welcome to Greenlit Perth. I am one of your hosts, Matthew Buss, and this is Ryan Svarek. And our guest today is the fantastic Jonathon Rowdon.
Thank you very much for that very overwrought intro.
Listen, I think the reputation is warranted. You were a personal mentor of mine back at Screen Academy, and you've had a long and storied career in the documentary sector. So I thought I'm doing that thing again where I'm making everything sound super formal. I did this with the last one. Yeah. Maybe I'm getting into 60 minutes mode. Yeah. I think it's maybe the setup we've got this time around. I think it's just the intimidating seating we have at the moment because you're like a lot higher than us right now. I feel like we're being scolded by a teacher.
So seniority wins through.
All right, so we've got some jerking today.
But yeah, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself and your journey through the film sector and how you ended up here?
Gee, it's a pretty long story. I realised that next year is my 40th anniversary in post-production, which is a long time to be in post-production. So I started out basically working in London, and I started in 1982, and as you know, that's the 40 years nearly up, and as a freelance assistant editor, working for a couple of guys who had, and even then things were weird because there's two guys said to me, would I assist two guys who had two cutting rooms, and if I assisted both of them, they would pay me 1.5 times what you would get for one assistant. So they were saving money and I was making money. And I just said, yeah. And I did that for a couple of years, and then I joined the BBC in 1984, at the end of 1984, and stayed there for 10 years. And then in the huge round of redundancies that they made in the mid-90s, I put my hand up and said, let me go, and they let me go. And then I became a freelance editor until 2002. And then for some unknown reason, I decided to up sticks from London and move here to Perth. And
Were you expecting there to be a film industry in Perth?
No, I moved here fully expecting that my career was finished in television and post-production. I had no idea there was anything here. And then I had a very weird experience where I had a phone call one day from an unidentified person who said to me, I gather you're an editor, and I gather you've just moved to Perth, and I gather you've been in London. And I thought, this is a scam, something weird going on here. Anyway, it turned out to be Mike Sill from Storyteller Productions, and he asked me to go in and talk to them about cutting a documentary that he was making. And he'd got my name at a party from a friend of mine who was a mutual acquaintance of his. And that's how the whole thing works in Perth, and I had never experienced anything like it, because that's not how it works in London.
I was going to say, it's like, that's all I know.
It's all about the network.
Yeah, but this place, you know, they talk about the 6 degrees of separation, and well, in Perth, obviously there isn't 6 degrees of separation, and you know, I had this, and I went in there, talked to him, and I think within 10 days I was cutting a documentary for him. And then people obviously heard there was a new face in town, and you know, you always cause a bit of a stir when something new and unknown turns up. And,
you almost said unusual. It's
yeah, new and unusual. That was me. And I haven't stopped. So since 2002, I've just been flat out doing it. And who knew that Perth had this really thriving little industry here? And that was, I guess, the big shock for me, was knowing that I could continue to do what I used to do and stay here and do it. Because originally people had said to me, oh, well, you know, if you want to carry on in film and television, you've got to go and work in Sydney. And I didn't want to live in Sydney. I wasn't interested in that. And so I suppose the changing shape and the growth of the industry here has kind of been, I've sort of gone along with just seeing how it's gone in the last 20 years nearly.
Because I imagine it would be, like you said, massive culture shock coming from somewhere as big in production as London, especially working for the BBC, and then coming to the middle of nowhere, basically. Which I know everyone. Look, I personally think we give ourselves a bad rap, but let's be honest, we're the most remote city on the planet. So there's definitely that. But then to have, like you said, that chance encounter that got you back into the industry here. What was your impression of the industry when you first stepped in? And then how do you think it's kind of evolved and changed over the years?
Well, I think there are two things that have happened. One is that the Perth industry itself has changed enormously within itself. But the whole, what you would now have to term the screen industry, has changed beyond recognition as well. I mean, if you think about it, 2002, when I first came here, you would be making TV programs basically ostensibly mostly for ABC and SBS. Who were the only people who were making what you would call serious documentaries. I felt when I first came here that their expectations were not awfully high. And I felt that there was a lot of stuff that was being done, and I don't mean to be disparaging, but I didn't feel like the standards expected of me from other people were the standards I expected of myself. Because I'd come from the culture in London where everybody expected you to reach those standards, because everything you were making was not just for a domestic audience, it was going to go globally. And that's the big change that's happened in Perth. Is, of course, now we have a screen industry where everything is global, and we have companies here making stuff where they used to make programs for ABC almost exclusively. Now they don't make any programs for ABC, SBS, that kind of stuff. They're making them for Discovery and National Geographic, and then you have to apply their standards and their criteria to it. And so just in terms of the quality of the material that I've been working on and editing, it's gone through the roof in 20 years in Perth. But not only that, is that everybody's having to rethink how they do stuff now, because there's so much competition. We're all aware budgets are incredibly tight, timelines are tight, there's a lot of competition to get into Discovery Channel or wherever it is, and so the expectations also on particularly post-production have changed a lot. I'm not sure that I would say that I don't find it particularly onerous, because I get longer to cut a 1 hour documentary now than I used to 25 years ago. So I would and also bearing in mind that a 1 hour documentary for somebody like Discovery Channel is only 44 or 46 minutes worth of airtime. Yeah. And whereas, if you...
Because it's the commercial hour. Yeah, or the commercial
hour, where I always worked almost exclusively for a non-commercial organisation, and that's 59 and a half minutes with a half-minute turnover time. So, I'm cutting extra 15 minutes odd, and getting an average of sort of 6 weeks to cut a 60-minute documentary. Whereas now you'd probably get 8. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. But so I don't find it particularly more difficult than I used to. But what I do like is the fact that everybody has big expectations now, and you're working on a global basis, which is, when I first came here, that went away, and now it's come back big time. And everything I do now is going, global, and people are making, there's a big thing for things like theatrical documentaries, which there never used to be.
Well, you actually directed a documentary, I believe, Birthplace of the Giants?
Yes, I've directed a couple. Well, I've sort of co-directed with a couple of wildlife documentaries, but Birthplace of the Giants, I sort of directed most of it because I dealt with the people side of it. So it was basically a film about the whale migration up the west coast. And we spent 35 days on a whale research vessel traveling up the coast and then tootling around in the Kimberley looking for whales, and and I filmed the whale researchers.
So, but what's interesting is that, and I don't know if it's necessarily typical of other industries, but it seems like you made a very lateral move from editorial to direction, and I don't know how common that is elsewhere. But do you think the ecosystem that Perth has gave you that opportunity, or did you kind of take that?
Yeah, I think so. I think that one of the things that you see very greatly in Perth is the size of crews is very small. And so therefore, if you can combine 2 or 3 jobs. So when I did Birthplace of the Giants, we basically had a 3-person team, 2 cameras and 1 director. And that was all of it. When we were on the expedition, we had a sound recordist working with us as well, but that was the entirety of the team, because A, we couldn't get any more people on the boat, and B, there was no, it had to be small. And so they said, look, I'd cut a couple of full-length documentaries for the company beforehand. And they said to me, would you like to direct it? So I said, yeah. I'm not entirely sure. I'm not sure that directing is my forte. I don't, but I was happy to do it, and I learned an awful lot. I actually learned an awful lot about editing while I was doing it, weirdly enough, because
yeah. I was going to say, I reckon the best advice I give to anyone who says, "Oh, I want to be a director," I'm like, learn how to edit first. But then teaches you what you need, what you're looking for, what might be lacking in other projects you've worked on. And
and you also naturally bring the skills you already have to the edit, and like you always edit from a basis that like I know, Ryan, you were or are a musical person, you play instruments, etc. So you went very specifically to sound, because we had this discussion recently actually. Whereas I kind of come from a performance background, so I look for that in what I'm cutting, and these things bleed into your craft. Going then from editing to directing, you kind of see the flip of the coin, because I know that I get a little bit annoyed sometimes with some decisions directors make when they film. But you kind of also, I think, get to all right, don't do me dirty like this. But you kind of get like the flip of the coin. You know what's going on the opposite end, and you kind of can, like you say, it helps inform your edit. Yes,
I mean, I think as an editor becoming a director, one of the big temptations is to undershoot, because you reckon you go into something knowing exactly what you need, and then you have to actually free yourself up from that and remember to get everything, because so you're trying not to overshoot, but you're trying not to undershoot at the same time. And it's a constant kind of mental battle that you're having with yourself about shooting the right stuff and getting the right footage and all that kind of thing.
Is that something you encounter a lot with directors here in Perth, that they either do or don't get the balance?
I believe that it's probably the biggest bugbear of my life nowadays as just a straight editor, is that the ability to shoot and just to turn a camera on and you've got a couple of cards and you can fill up your card and then offload it to a drive and then put the card back in and just carry on going, is that we used to refer to it many years ago as spray and pray shooting, which you would just shoot everything and hope you got something. And I think that there has been a tendency for there to be a lack of discipline in shooting.
Well, the tech also helps with that. When you're shooting digitally, you're not dealing with physical tape. You're not dealing with film.
Yeah. But it's not costing you any more, because all you have to do is buy a hard drive and offload the cards. And so therefore it doesn't matter. Whereas, I come from a background where they would shoot on 16mm film, and then they would, and there would be a set number of rolls they were allowed to shoot a day. So, people would have mostly shoot sort of 6 to 7 rolls a day, which is 60 to 70 minutes roughly a day on a shoot. And that's what you would get. But you would be working on shooting ratios where, I've worked on very, very big projects, documentary projects, where it's particularly back in the 16mm days, where people were disappointed if the shooting ratio went over 12:1. And it's now,
which is insane.
I mean, I worked with I did the first of the Michael Palin Round the World series, which is Around the World in 80 Days. And working on that, the producer of it, who was producer-director, when we sat down and watched the rushes, which we were able to do in a week, watch all the rushes for the entire series in 1 week, end-to-end single speed, which is madness now if you think about it now. But he calculated that we were due to deliver 6 50-minute films. And he said, my shooting ratio is up there 14, 15 to 1. And I'm really disappointed in myself. turned out that we actually managed to get a whole extra episode out of it. So we actually made 7 episodes, which brought his ratio down to
so he was
12 to 1.
Yeah.
So he was then going back to being, that's my
that just sounds like fiddling the numbers though.
Well, it was, because otherwise. But, that's the thing. And I think that, I've worked on things where the ratio's 400-500 to 1. And the big problem, I think, is for an editor nowadays is that it's very, very difficult to hold all that information in your head. And for an editor, knowing your material, I think, is the critical part of your job, is that you have to know the material better than anybody else, including your director. And that to me is a big step that we have to try and find a way where people are going out with the idea that they've got a stronger sense of what it is they're trying to shoot. Because I see a lot of stuff, when documentaries come back and I'm actually going through, and the first thing I do is go through and kind of, not so much, you don't invent the story, but you have to dig the story out of the rushes and then discuss whether or not that's the story you want to tell with the rushes. Whereas that was not a decision you used to have to make. That you would watch the rushes and you knew what the story was.
Well, I was going to actually ask about, because my understanding, at least of older methods of cutting, you would generally basically be wedded at the hip to the director for a very long duration during that process. And these days, it seems to be less and less the director being in the edit suite, at least for those initial discussions. And more on the editor to actually craft the narrative. Do you think that that's a good practice or something that's like evolved out of the process? Or do you think that that's something that maybe we should be looking at again with a bit more of a close eye?
Well, I think actually I sort of slightly disagree with you, because one of the things is that I think that you had the ear of the director whenever you needed it, back in what I would call the old days.
Right, yeah.
And because of the kind of small amount of material you were dealing with, you didn't need them there so much. And then sort of, I would say, sort of 10 to 15 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, there was a big trend for the director to come and plonk themselves down in the cutting room and sit next to you for the entire duration of the edit. Yeah. And now they've invented this new thing, which is an expression I don't like, but it's become universal, of the predator, which is the producer-editor.
Sounds like you're going to walk in and find like a skull hanging off the wall.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to be able to do that thing, where you go invisible when you're in a tree.
Or just in the edit bay. Scroll away.
And I think that that's something whereby nowadays, I like it, but I don't think it's good for the younger generation, because I think it's very, very difficult. There's a lot of, for me, I've been doing this an awful long time, and if you stick me in a cutting room and the extent of the briefing for the edit is, here are some rushes, and then they walk away and give it to you, I'm happy with it, I'm fine. But for people who are emerging in this industry, that can be really daunting, especially when there's a lot of stuff and also that level of responsibility. So I would expect in many cases to be given the rushes, to have a basic discussion about them, to cut them, to choose the music, to choose the narrative line. If the film contains narration, I would write at least the first draft of the narration. And I would expect to do that now. And that's something that I think has become fairly universal in the industry. As I say, my fear of it, and, as you know, because you were in the first year that I taught at Screen Academy, that I have a big fear for the emerging people. And that's why I go back and teach at Screen Academy, because I want to try and pass on the stuff that I don't get the opportunity to pass on in terms of learning in the industry. And it's something where, I've had a career where, since I've been freelance, which is 1994, which is, good God, 15 years ago, whatever, 25 years ago, sorry. I've been out of work for like 6 months in 25 years. And
aggregate or just in a block?
Overall.
Okay.
Yeah.
Solid.
Good stuff.
So, and I'm so lucky and so fortunate, but also I believe that that's a result of the training I got. Because when I went to the BBC, I was taught by people in the days where you had an editor in the room and an assistant had another set of gear in the same room because the gear cost like $30 to put in and you didn't have to buy computers and all that sort of stuff. And the first thing that would happen is that once you'd finished preparing all the rushes for the editor, they would turn around and say, take some film off the shelf and cut some scenes. And you'd be doing that, within 6 weeks of my starting to work with the first editor I worked as an assistant once I finished my traineeship, I was cutting. And
which, like, my experience personally has never, I didn't really get the chance to do that in any of the jobs that I was working in these major post house because it was basically purely a technical plug.
Yes, exactly.
And that's kind of what they expected. And that's fair because, you can also make the argument that you're inexperienced, but then as you point out, how do you get the experience of being an editor?
And it's the craft experience that's missing. That's what's missing. And, so as you know from being with me at Screen Academy, I don't really concentrate very hard on the technical stuff.
No, it's all about
because
craft.
you can learn it. I mean, you can just go on and if you just go on YouTube, do online tutorials or whatever and figure out how to use the software. But the craft stuff is really, only the only way of learning it is to do it and then have somebody else talk to you and say, do you know what? Why don't you try this? Why don't you do that? Why don't you do the other? And I think that that's really something that's going to be quite that level of craft training is going to diminish and diminish and diminish because everybody wants assistant editors who can just process rushes and get them to the editors quickly. But people like myself are not going to be around forever. And if the next generation of editors are not having the craft training, then where are they going to maintain the standards? Because the standards are not being
carried over.
And, while I understand that the industry is evolving and people have different expectations and all that, you still have to be able to pull a story out of rushes.
I was going to say.
You off before
No, I was going to say, you should ask this. Go ahead.
I was going to just mention, that was probably one of the things that actually did me most while I was in the Screen Academy is when some of the lecturers or some of the heads of department and stuff like that were suggesting, hey, why don't we try this in the edit? Why don't we think? And people getting frustrated and go, or even to the directors saying it to them going, why don't we try this? And it's like, no, don't like it, don't want to do it. And it's like, hey, that doesn't hurt you to make a new sequence, try the thing out and see, it might not work for the film, it might, but at the same time, you've learned a new way of cutting.
Yes.
It might be applicable to your next project.
Yes.
And at the very least, you also get to work out how to work people because that is part of the gig as the editor. Because in a lot of ways, I think you actually put it to me that in a lot of ways, we have to act as a psychiatrist to all the other production heads. In a lot of ways.
Yeah. You're dealing with a lot of different things and people, particularly directors and stuff when you work direct, they've put a lot of heart, soul and time and effort into making a film.
Yeah. And they have to carry that.
And I've worked with directors in the past and clearly their attitude, to the editor is their thought is that the editor's only job in life is to fuck up their film. and you have to then dissuade them of that argument. And one of the problems is that if you then disagree about something, that if you say, why don't we try this, then they become defensive. And I've had that, 2 or 3 occasions, over the years where, and you have to decide whether or not you're going to reach an agreement about doing it. And sometimes as an editor, I've actually done it in secret. I've actually recut film and then just showed them because I didn't want the argument. Here's a copy.
What do you think?
Yeah, exactly. I did that on a thing I cut last year where I was asked, a young couple had come in and made a theatrical feature documentary and they had been cutting it for 2 years. And they had got to the point where they said, we've just run out. We don't know what to do with it. And then a mutual friend of ours said, oh, could you go and have a look at it? And I looked at it and I just said to them, this is a great story, but not with those sequences and not in that order.
Yeah.
You're like, oh shit. And so I went in and worked on it for a while. And then we were getting there. And then towards the end of the edit, I had a fairly dramatic idea which involved taking a sequence from very, very near the end and putting it very, very near the beginning, and then the resultant destruction of the whole shape of the film And I thought if I discuss it with them, they're probably going to be resistant.
Yeah.
So I just, over the course of a weekend and a couple of days after that, while we were waiting for something to happen, we were waiting for a pickup shoot to be sent in, I recut it and sent it to them and said, don't think, just look. And then let me know what you think. And then they came back and they said, oh, okay, why have you done that? And I explained why. And they said, right, we're going to go away and think about it. And about 48 hours, they came back to me and said, we think we want to go with this new structure. But that was me kind of being able to be in the heads of the people. And that's something, again, if you don't spend much time in cutting rooms, you don't, as an assistant, seeing how editors deal with that, you don't see, and actually, there's a lot you can learn from industry professionals, long-term industry professionals, about what it's like to be an editor as opposed to just editing. And I think it's important.
And it's a great place to be to learn, because you have such a, I can't think of any other production role where you have more access to every department.
Yeah.
Because you deal with picture, you deal with sound, you deal with production, you deal with directors, you deal with producers, you deal with executive producers, and then commissioning editors.
Yeah.
And those are all face-to-face conversations that you have.
Yes.
And that is pretty much the entire industry. I mean, except perhaps the VFX artist, which you probably teleconference with.
Yes.
That's about it. Yeah. And even then you do have...
But even then you have to accommodate them when you've got all that going on and stuff. Yeah. So, I mean, it is, you do get kind of, as it were, exposed to it all. And I think that's something where just experiencing it for a short while as part of a post-production team can be incredibly valuable to people. I've seen, from students and also from, emerging people in the industry, where things get quite nasty and quite personal and all that kind of stuff. And it was never intended to be, it never set out to be that way. What happened is that somebody just expressed themselves slightly wrongly, and then it's gone from there. And that's really, so sometimes you just have to sit back and think, I want to have a conversation with somebody about this, but I'm going to give it 24 hours, because if I'm annoyed, angry, tired, whatever, I'm going to wait until that's gone and then talk to them about it.
We've made that mistake a few times.
But the thing is, we kept talking, and that was the thing. That was the thing.
Yeah. We never let ourselves stop, though.
Yes.
We go, all right,
momentum.
Frustrated.
Yeah.
This is why I'm frustrated. All right, stop.
Yes.
Now tell me the points you want.
Yes.
Cool.
Yeah.
Now you tell me your point.
Yes.
But we'll get that.
Yeah.
It's a fantastic little dynamic that we have, because we'll both go at each other as hard as we can, and then break and go, okay, cool. Well, now we found where we both disagree and had a massive row over it.
Yeah.
Cool. How do we fix this?
Yeah.
And that's partnerships in the development of that.
But don't you find that when you think about it, you're not actually rowing with each other at all. You're actually talking about the film.
Yeah.
And when you think about it, you say, actually, it's got nothing to do with whether I agree with Ryan or disagree with Ryan, or if I agree with Matt or whatever. It's to do with what's the best thing for the film.
Exactly.
And that's the thing I always try and impress on everybody, from the students, is that your sole focus has got to be, can I make this film better?
Exactly.
And your sole purpose in life is to make the film better. Yeah. And by piping up and making suggestions and stuff like that, you have to do it. But you have to sit down and kind of get into the head of the directors and producers you're working with to know how to do that, to know how to say to somebody, do you know what? I don't think this is as good as it can be.
I've had to work in a lot of the documentary series and stuff that I have as a pretty much one-man band. A lot of the time I'm a shooter, editor, sometimes even pretty much directing without realizing that I was meant to be there to direct, because they're trusting me, because they're going, well, you're shooting it, you're going to be putting it together. You probably know the structure that you want for this as we put it together.
Yes.
Have you found, it's taken me a long time to kind of separate from that mechanical side of just getting the content, churning it out, getting the content, churning it out. And Matt's had to call me out a few times, even in some of the projects we're working on now.
It's okay, you call me out plenty of times as well.
With complete fairness, that's why I like working with each other. But have you found that that's really affected sort of the industry as a whole by having director editors taking over all the things? Because I found that every role has been condensed.
Yeah. I mean, there is an element. I work on the basis that in the industry, the people who rule the industry are the producers, because they hold the purse strings. They hold the money. And if they thought they could get away with not employing a director or not employing an editor or not employing a shooter, they would, because it would save them money. And they still go ahead and fill all those roles, generally with different people. And I think that, in my opinion, you can be good at all of them, but I'm not entirely sure you can be great at all of them at the same time. And that's I mean, I'm not saying that
I think that's a very
can.
fair comment.
I'm not saying nobody can either, but there are people who probably can. But I've met shooter directors, for example, who can shoot and can direct, but not at the same time. I've met shooter directors who can but don't, so they're either shooting or directing at the same time. I've met shooter directors who are brilliant at both simultaneously. Not many, but I have. But one of the things that I think is really most difficult if you're shooting and editing is the fact that once it gets onto a screen in an edit or, in a review or whatever, it has a different life than when you were shooting it. There are things going on when you're on location, when you're shooting, that happen which give you a sense of what's going on, and that may not translate to what's on the screen because obviously you've only got what you're seeing, the context has disappeared.
Or you don't shoot the context in a way that actually explains itself on the screen, the story.
Yeah.
Just something I've discovered with some of my own work, actually. Yeah.
But I was working on a film a few years ago, and it's a good example of where they came back and they were talking about this sequence and they just said it was incredible. It was amazing. It was like this hugely emotionally charged atmosphere. And they said it was just a great scene and we want to make a big kind of statement with this scene in the film. And it just wasn't there. It was there on the set when they were shooting, but it was something to do with the collective all kind of getting into the same emotional state, and the sound recordist and the shooter and everything like that. And the
theatre performance versus film performance.
And then when you
energy.
Exactly. And then you looked at it on screen and I said, I don't feel it. I can't see it. Yeah. And I understand what you thought it was, but this has now got a different life. And as a shooter editor, I don't know how you could do it, frankly. I can't shoot, so that's a big use. That's very useful to me because I can't shoot, so I never have to worry about this problem. But one of the things that I think is really difficult is to walk in and then basically say, right, I'm going to blank out everything I did while I was shooting and just think about it from an editing perspective. I think that must be incredibly difficult. And to kind of, what you need is one of those things from Men in Black where you've flash yourself in the eye and then you can't remember anything you shot, and then it's just like seeing rushes for the first time because you always lack the ability to have that first impression because you've shot it.
That's a good call, because I always end up cookie cutter because of this job, because speaking of the Perf industry, as you said, there's not a lot of budget in it. It's a lot of things, most of the TV shows I've produced have been a crew of two.
Yes.
Obviously in the production side of things, and that was not uncommon. And I'm still traveling the world, doing all this amazing stuff. And I'm going, oh, this is great. And then I'm just going, is this what the industry is going to be here, where it's that limited? But I think having those different people involved in those different moments actually helps create a bit more color, a bit more perspective, and makes the content translate more, because you've actually got, just because I understand it doesn't mean someone else knows, as you said, that context.
Yes.
Well, it's knowing, like, in that emotional moment, that you're not just sitting in the wide.
Yes,
because it's very hard. Like, it can be done, but it's very hard to do that with just one wide shot where you're seeing the action play out. But that comes again back down to knowing how to shoot something for emotional impact.
Yeah,
and being able to recognize in that moment when you're feeling that emotional impact that you need to cover it.
Yes,
and it was interesting because I just had a thought about, because you're talking about how assistant editors are very often technical, basically editors or just ingestion technicians. I find it interesting that shooters now have more of a chance of becoming an editor than an edit assistant by that kind of metric, because they tend to get more of a look in.
Yes.
And I don't know, maybe the suggestion that should go out to all the aspiring editors is learn how to film. Yeah. Because you'll probably get to find out. Because interestingly, I found out when I was in LA a couple of years ago from a guy who was a professional stunt double, that the easiest way to become a director in a feature film in Hollywood is to be a stunt coordinator.
Really?
So you go in and you work as a stunt coordinator, and what happens is they'll give you a B unit so that you go out and shoot all the stunts. And then that means that you get to direct that sequence. And then that builds your direction reel. And then the producer that will see your directing reel will go, oh, well, I've got an action film coming up. It's a small, low budget. We're not going to have enough to be able to have additional units. We'll pull you in because you know how to direct action. And then from there, they can then build out their repertoire. So his career path was through stunts, which just seemed really strange to me. But we're watching this sort of industry evolve at the moment. And again, having the longer scope, sorry, not trying to call you old or anything, but having the longer eye on it, it's interesting to see how you see it transforming over time. And
I mean, I think that one of the things I think has been really interesting for me being in Perth, because it's a small town, you kind of see and hear a lot more. You know, you tend to be like an island. Working in somewhere like London, you go around and do stuff, and you'll bump into people, but you don't hear a lot about what's going on, whereas kind of here you sort of know mostly what's happening in the industry, and in the
or at least whispers.
Yeah. But in the 20 years I've been here, the way the industry has changed, and you can see it's easier to follow in somewhere like Perth, is that how much more complex the industry is now than it used to be. I mean, there used to be basically if you wanted to be in what they called the screen industry. When I started out, you either went into TV or you went into feature films. And sometimes you would start in one and move into the other. And that was a common career path. I've got friends who started off working with me at the BBC and now cut, $100 million, $200 million feature films.
Like Blade Runner.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And they've made the transition across, but basically based on their craft skills, and everything was about your craft skills, and everything there was, you could be taught everything you needed to know technically in a month, basically, in those days, which is like nowadays. Imagine knowing everything you need to know.
Yeah.
Partly because you didn't have to do it, but you had to know, grading and all that sort of stuff. Nowadays, people would expect you to be able to do it, whereas you knew you were never going to have to be able to do it. When I started out, all you needed to know was how to communicate with the graders about color balance and all that kind of stuff. So you were given all the tools you needed. But nowadays, everything is so much more complex, and there are so many more outlets for what you're doing. So you've got, you guys make Facebook videos, and I've got friends who work on YouTube channels, and then I've got friends who work on multi-million-dollar feature films, and people who work in the traditional TV space. So they're working on stuff that's being sold through to BBC, ABC, whatever it is. And then people who are working in the other space, which is what used to be the traditional TV broadcasters that are now on the video on demand platforms like Discovery Channel, all those people who have gone into that. And now,
we're smack dab in the middle of a massive piece of market upheaval because, I mean, we all knew that cinema was on the decline, but the pandemic's just killed it dead, more or less. And I don't know if it will recover to anywhere near the prior to pandemic levels.
I was chuffed to go watch Mortal Kombat the other day. Even though it's not a great film or anything like that, it was so nice to go to a cinema and watch that. I was just like, I'm having the nicest time.
That's the thing. I think they do need to sell it as an experience or a night out, and that requires, and they kind of have already been doing that with like the gold class stuff where you get like in the seat service and all that sort of stuff. But but with that comes the price tag, which means that it becomes more exclusive, which means only certain people are going to be interested in it, and then.
Do you guys think that this is something I've heard, and I don't know whether or not I feel about it, but do you think that the cinema experience has become quite polarized lately? I was talking to somebody a little while ago who was telling me, I've just cut 2 feature documentaries for cinematic release. Yeah. And there's they're doing really well in the cinemas, and this guy was saying there's a big demand for them. And I said, I don't really understand why. And he said, well, because there is this perception that nearly all cinema now is kind of made for 12-year-olds, i.e. your Mortal Kombat or whatever, your Thor movies. And it's polarized the audiences. So there's all this whole group of people who now want to go and see what you would call a grown-up film, whether or not it's the right terminology, I don't know. But do you think that's happened?
I get where you're coming from. The argument I would make is I think that a lot of the narrative-based stuff has gone more in the route of television and drama-based. So if you want to invest in a long-term story that's going to have some real depth and some real payoff, you go in there. It's a spectacle, the cinema now.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with that.
No.
But that's what it's become. So it's like, instead of, all right, let's spread this budget over this long time to build something, it's like, let's just chuck this budget like right here and make something that just like, it's like a ride almost. Yeah. And it's nothing, it's its own thing. But I think if you're going to the cinema for an hour and a half, you kind of almost want to just feel like cheap excitement, like a thrill.
Yeah, it definitely is spectacle, is what I would say. Cinema is spectacle now. And I think that's partially because of the way that streaming platforms have come in. Like for me as a consumer, I'm more willing to sit down with a large slew of library, series and get really super engaged in the emotional journeys of a character in a television format than I would say a heart-wrenching feature film, because I think it's about the amount of content that I'm consuming at the cinema. And if I'm paying the ticket price for a 2-hour experience versus a $15 price for a month where I can have as much of an experience as I want, that $20 kind of needs to really wow me.
Yeah.
And that's the thing I think that's, and that's the thing, that's why the Marvel films did so well. Yes. But the clever thing that they did was they interlocked a lot of their narratives around a central thrust. But even they're turning towards series. Like you're looking at WandaVision, and they've just, the Captain America and the Falcon. The Winter Soldier and the Falcon, whatever it's called. But the transition into these formats, I think, is not necessarily a bad thing, because I think we're seeing a lot smarter television as a result. Because you're seeing a lot of the people who would do the really tight, characterful features are now telling the same stories but in longer formats. And because of that, they're bringing the cinema look. Feel to the series. Like I've been binging at the moment a series called Billions, which has got Paul Giamatti in it, and I'll watch a lot of stuff with Paul Giamatti in it because I think he's a fantastic actor.
Paul Giamatti.
Yeah, exactly that. He's a tubby Italian American, and he's fantastic because he just owns it. Every time he's on the screen, he says, "This is me," and he can be the really nice one who's really well-meaning and kind of down in the dumps, or he can be a total prick, and it's always somewhere between that. But anyway, he's a big draw card for me. But the narrative itself is really cutthroat. There's lots of high stakes, but it's all interpersonal, because they'll talk about money because it's all about hedge funds. And they'll be like, oh, 2 billion, 3 billion. But the numbers actually don't seem to matter. It's more about am I being outfoxed by my enemy? And that's where the dramatic engine sort of lies. So it's really fascinating for me to watch. But I'm so much more drawn into that than Mortal Kombat! But I do want to turn my brain off sometimes and go watch that.
Well, the great thing about cinema, and for any screen thing, is that the great thing is that if that's your taste, that's your taste. There's no point in telling people that their taste is somehow wrong because it's not your taste.
Yeah. Jaws 4 is one of my favourite films. It's garbage.
But you know what? I think there are two things. That's one of the things that really I think is really interesting. You talk about the spectacle thing, and now we're seeing people making documentaries which go into a space where you need spectacle, and there is something of a dilemma there, is that if you go out and shoot a kind of cinematic documentary, then how documentary is it? Yeah. And and that you get to the point where the reality of it becomes a little bit blurry.
Questionable,
but nevertheless, the fact that you can work on stuff where that is a consideration is great. But I think the thing I think is great about the streaming platforms is that, I don't know for how many years I was constantly being told when I was editing stuff, you've got to cut this, it's got to be quicker, it's got to be, because the audience has got, the attention span of a flea and all this. And now you've got documentary and drama series that are coming out on Netflix or whatever and are 6, 8, 10 hours long, and people are watching the whole thing. And the whole thing about attention span has been absolutely proved to be incorrect.
Yeah, and we've also kind of lost the locked-in commercial half hour. People are just making it for the length it needs to be, which is really freeing.
I was going to say, this is the argument I make, and this is sort of what we were talking about a little bit earlier. It's about making the right content for the right platform.
Yes.
If you're on Facebook and you try to put some heavy, long drama on there, no one is going to consume it, because people are there to just for a quick dopamine hit, just to quickly escape, do their thing. And with YouTube, people will go, all right, I'm kind of here for, it depends what you're there for. YouTube's a multifaceted entertainment system.
Yes.
But when you're putting Netflix on, that usually means I'm stopping for the day.
Invest in
I'm happy to take the time now. It's coming that's an active choice to put that on.
Yes.
And same with the movies. But yeah, the short attention span, everyone's basing that off social media. And it's like, yes, it's very true on that platform. But in general,
it's contextual.
Yes. But what they're doing is taking one particular delivery medium and then categorizing everybody based on that. And instead of saying, well, I'm quite happy to, somebody will watch a 5-minute thing on YouTube and have enough of it and then sit down and watch, 10 episodes of something because that's what they want to see. I think
I think there's ritual involved though.
Yeah.
It sounds weird to say, but like when you used to go to the theatre for like a live performance, you'd sit down, you'd talk with your friends, there'd be lots of hubbub. And because I used to be a stage performer, but then they would lower the lights and the curtain would open and you'd be put in, it was the signal was given to everyone, okay, contextually, you are now meant to quiet and pay attention. Yes. And if you didn't, you were the jerk who was talking at the cinema. And that's the kind of thing that I think like the social media platforms like Netflix have. I mean, even if you're just sitting watching it on your laptop in your bedroom, the screen goes black, and then you're in.
Yes.
And that kind of almost dictates and trains people to have those attention spans. And maybe you don't like the show and you tune out after 5 minutes, but then same thing, screen goes black.
Find something else,
And that's I think a big deal about building your product for these platforms is knowing that you're having sort of a live theatre experience in every different type of format that you're going to. You just need to know what that is.
People say target audience, it's also target platform. I think it's important.
Or target context.
Yeah. And I think that's something for guys like you, particularly, at your age, that as makers of content, you will actually have to have skills across all of those different things.
It's a very different game.
It's a different game. Whereas, I talk about so-called good old days and stuff, but there is no doubt that it was a lot simpler. You knew exactly what you were doing and why you were doing it and who you were doing it for and what they expected of you. And that was it. But nowadays, you can't be focused into that one thing anymore because it doesn't exist enough to give enough people a living. And the second thing is that that's not how the screen industry works anymore. It's simple as that. And I've seen, brilliant, I think 2 or 3 years ago at Screen Academy, they made a little video of, for a crowdfunding thing. And it was just great. And I thought, they've had to actually sit down and make that, and it's got all the production value and everything they needed to do it, to raise $2,000 so that they could hire a drone or something like that, whatever it was. And I'm thinking to myself, their little crowdfunding video was brilliant. It was actually better than their film. And you just thought, but this is and I just thought, gosh, they're going to have to be in all of that. They're going to have to be able to do all of those different things.
Well, you look at the high flyers on a lot of like YouTube and streaming services, and they are constantly talking about the meta. And the thing is because they basically have to almost dedicate themselves to one platform and really understand, how like getting noticed works, how you market specifically to that, never mind anything else.
Yeah.
And then inside that, then also have to develop a brand, and then also they have to have a certain level of technical capability. And even if it is a bit, I think the kids are calling it scuffed. No, they call even if it's a bit dodgy looking, right? That still is acceptable because it is still kind of like, it's kind of like, I guess, the equivalent of a bunch of people getting a Super 8 machine and making a feature film, but not having any formal training, and then just managing to get it up in the local cinema.
Yes.
To give it like an analog.
But that bit of amateurness or that not polish as you're talking about, it's kind of like why people like influencers and stuff like that, because there's that little bit of, I could maybe do this.
Yes.
And then I can see myself in them, and then it feels like I'm rooted, like I'm there for them because I want to be there for me as well. There's a little bit of that in a lot of that context. I was going to ask a question. What would be, as a primary editor, what would be your main advice for an editor trying to break into the scene in Perth at the moment?
Well, I think that I mean, it sounds like a cliche, but one of the things is that you've got to edit. And if you're not editing for other people and being paid to do it, then you have to do it for yourself. And I advised people to go out and shoot stuff on their iPhones and just figure out how to cut it, and because you need a portfolio of stuff that proves you can edit. And I've worked with, when I worked on the feature documentary at the end of last year, beginning of this one, we had a girl who came on as an editing attachment, and she was a really good editor, but she was really struggling to get any traction in the industry because she just couldn't get enough stuff.
Yeah, reel.
On a reel, and enough variation and enough that says, I can see, how so somebody can work out how good they are. And it's all very well to show people a film, but you need to say, I've done this much stuff. People, you say, well, when I turned up in Perth in 2002, I had already had 20 years under my belt. And so I'm really convinced that one of the reasons that I found no trouble getting work is that when I opened up my CV, it just dropped down like that, and it was pages of stuff.
You've actually told me once upon a time you don't really bother sending CVs. You just go, well, here's the latest one I've worked on.
Yeah.
It's actually quite difficult these days because people that are established are staying in the industry longer than they ever have, which is not a bad thing. They've earned that position. But it's hard to get a call as a new person because there's so much, there's this entry level of noise now, because even not filmmakers have cameras now, just vloggers, Facebookers, YouTubers, everyone is kind of a filmmaker these days.
Yes.
Well, maybe not filmmaker, but definitely content
They can make
creators.
content,
Yes. It's definitely a challenge for people. I mean, certainly for what they call emerging practitioners, I was even more blessed than that, is that my first long-term job in the industry was at the BBC, and you can't help making the contact base because you're working for an organization which is full of producers, directors, whatever, editors, other editors. And you then, when you leave that organization, they go into, at the time I left, the reason I left is that they were outsourcing a lot of their post-production. So I literally was working on a project, and then they basically were told they needed to outsource that project. So I left and took the outsourcing with me, with a few bits of jiggery-pokery to keep it all legal and above board. But then I traded then for the following 10 years on my contact base within the BBC. I never cut anything for any of the other broadcasters until about 7 or 8 years after I left the BBC. And so, and then of course you develop a CV that's as long as your arm. And then when I moved here, I had a long CV, and everybody looked at it and said, oh, well, you must know what you're doing.
What do you reckon is some of the positives about the Perf industry, and what do you reckon are some of the negatives that we need to work on?
The biggest positive in Perth is that it's small, and therefore if you have the right, if you've done the right stuff, you can build a reputation easily, and people will get to know you. But you're not a tiny fish in a huge pond. And that's exactly the same. That's the disadvantage, is that then a few people become the go-to people. Yeah. And the problem I see for people of your generation is that in editing, for example, it's people like me who get the phone call first, because they rely on the fact that I've done it 1,000 times before or whatever, and they can just bung me in a cutting room, and I'm a known quantity. It's not that I'm better than anybody else. It's not that I'm some kind of genius. No, exactly. Safe pair of hands. We know we can throw them in the cutting room, shut the door, and at some point within the next 3 or 4 weeks, a rough cut will come out. And the reason that they know that is because I've demonstrated that just by having been around a long time. And
they keep hiring him. He must still be. He must be okay.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well, he's not out of work, so that indicates that things are still going. And for you guys to prove the point, because I meet so many people, younger people, who are really good editors, who are really having trouble cracking the industry because they just don't have enough experience behind them. And the problem is that you can't build experience unless you're doing it. And so you're in that catch-22 situation where you can't get the experience that will get you the jobs because you can't get the jobs that will give you the experience. And therefore, it's really difficult. And
do you think that the rate of growth that we've sort of seen over the last couple of years has eased a little bit, because it does seem to be that there are now opportunities, but they're very competitive.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be the big change here, is going to be in the next few years when, there's this building this studio and all that sort of stuff, and there'll be more incentives to post-produce here. I mean, if you think about it, it's not that long ago that there were lots of incentives to shoot, and there were lots of incentives to, use locations in Western Australia, and there were no incentives for anybody to post-produce here. So they would come over here, shoot everything, and then pack all their bags and go back to Sydney or Melbourne or Brisbane or wherever it is and do their post-production there. Yeah. And what that has done, we have very many very capable people here, highly skilled. But the problem is that we're separated by the width of Australia from the people in Sydney or whatever. And when directors want to use an editor, they want somebody they know. They want to use somebody they have a personal relationship with. And although we do have editors here who do have relationships with people in Sydney and stuff, the majority of us don't, because we're based here and stuff like that. And so that's the thing that's going to tip it over. It's not about what's on your CV, how much you're going to charge, all those things. It's about, do I know the director, and would the director be happy sitting in the cutting room with me? You talk about, you've mentioned, Ryan, about this thing about, being easy to work with and all that sort of stuff. It's a massive part of this industry. A few years ago, I don't know whether you were around, Don McAlpine, the cinematographer, came and did his bit at... it was
just a little bit after we'd left, but we were kind of caught some of the tail
So he came over and did a kind of personal appearance at Screen Academy, and one of the students stood up at the end of the Q&A and said, "What's your best advice about breaking into the industry?" And his answer was, and I quote, "Don't be a dickhead." Yeah. And that was it.
Yeah.
It's very true.
And of course that's something whereby if you're not able to, so when there will be a financial incentive for companies to post-produce in Perth, those relationships will develop naturally, because everybody goes in and they sit down with somebody and they sit next to an editor they've never met before. And I've recommended people to edit things, and they've gone and sat with these people, and then, a couple of weeks later they've gone, "Oh, they're really good." And it's a shock. And
where do they come from?
I know they're really good. The only reason that you didn't know they were good is because you didn't know them at all. Yeah. And that will change. And so the expansion of the industry at that top level, that very high, expensive level of feature films and high-end documentaries and all that kind of stuff, that will make a big difference. And I think that will expand the industry from the floor upwards. And I think that there will be...
Hopefully it might even start branching more into drama, because that's sort of the area where I feel is a really strong deficit.
Yes.
And that's not by any other issue than we just don't have the production space really to sustain more than one drama, like studio-based drama, because we have the ABC studios, and that's probably it.
But we also have a bit of a, weirdly enough, over the breadth of the industry, I think we have a bit of a skills shortage here, because you don't meet that many good shooter directors, and you don't meet, there are not many good series producers, all those things that you need. And the main reason is not because people are no good. It's because very many people get into that position and think, I can't stay in Perth. Yeah. And so they take their skills, and the skills are being, there's a kind of a brain drain.
Yeah. It's almost like, to have a career in Perth, you need to go to Sydney and have a career in Sydney, and then move back, and then you can have a career.
I mean, I know 2 or 3 people who're really good at their job and have said, and a couple of students that came out of Screen Academy and just said, "I'm not staying in Australia at all. I'm going to go and work in London or New York or whatever."
Both my peers uproot and moved. I mean, obviously, to be fair, one of them returned to her home country because she was a foreign student, but and now I believe that he's working in London. Funnily enough.
Yeah, sorry, when I was off on one of my
Dave. Hi,
Dave. No, but that right there is kind of the principle we talk into a lot of the documentaries we're making. Like, if we get a few international stories cross-pollinated with the Australian stories, it's going to be easier to sell internationally.
Yes.
And that's the tricky thing, because even trying to sell Australian content is even hard to the Australian market.
That's true.
So if we can't sell it here, how are we going to sell it overseas? So it's this weird...
and that's, me and Brian have made kind of the conscious decision to sit here and work the coalface and actually get the industry to grow in the direction where, I think if I have a really average career, but it breaks ground for others to kind of come up and not have to do what we've done, I think I'll be happy.
Whereas I'm stuff others, I just want to make bank. So
yeah,
I think that combination between us.
Look, I mean, I'm trying to look. Okay, I'll be honest. I'd rather be a billionaire on a yacht, But like, let's be realistic with our goals in some instances, and also shoot for the moon in others.
Yeah, but you know, one of the things that I think it's really kind of exciting and amazing is that you guys, like, I know you've got a drama thing in development, and you've been shooting, documentaries.
You're doing
and stuff
everything
like
we
that.
can.
You're doing everything exactly, and I think that's really amazing, because I think the other thing that I learned from my early part of my career was that the more breadth of stuff you work on, the better it makes you at everything else. So, for example, I think editing documentaries makes you a better drama editor, and I think editing drama makes you a better documentary editor. And they're not seen as crossing over,
which is odd.
Yeah, exactly. Because, but that's where I come from. They wouldn't consider making you specialize early on in your career, because that meant that it was narrowing your ability to produce what was required, and I think that
the thing is, the story is universal though. Like it's
exactly.
it's the wrapping really that we're discussing here. Like one of my favorite quotes, because you've given me quite a lot of pearls of wisdom over the years, has been doesn't matter what NLE you use, they're all just digital pairs of scissors.
Exactly. Yes.
And a lot of people do get caught up on the kit, I think.
Yeah.
And because we have to be technically savvy, but like at the end of the day, it comes down, can you make an emotional moment work with the shots you have?
Yeah.
And you can shoot that on Windows Media. You could use Windows Movie Maker.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and that's something that I think that younger people can be very obsessed with, this idea of, I need to know, this software or that software, and I have to understand it or whatever. And my advice is, learn the software when you need to know it to get the job. Yeah. So if somebody phones me up and says, I've got a job for you, I may not know what software we're working on until the day I walk into the cutting room. But it's likely to be Avid or Premiere Pro. And I'm happy on both of those. But the feature doc I cut last year, they said to me, we're editing it in DaVinci Resolve. And I said, okay, I need to postpone the edit by a week. And they said, why? And I said, I just need to go and do all the tutorials. And then when I get it, I said, when I start, you just have to expect for at least a week or 10 days that I'm all fingers and thumbs. But it doesn't affect the way I'm thinking about cutting the film. No. It just means that I'm looking for the button. Which one do I press to make it do that process?
It's all small variations on the process. Because the thing is, it all boils down to the same stuff.
Yeah.
Bring your footage in, look at the rushes, make your choices, go through to an assembly, and then deliver.
Yeah, exactly. And I would have ended up within any particular scene choosing that particular cut point for that particular moment, no matter what software I was using.
Or shortcut.
Yes, exactly. And it's that. But again, it's easy to become caught up in the technical stuff, and it's quite a good deflection sometimes for when things get difficult. You can be working on films that are incredibly difficult, and it's that whole thing. We went when we went to the premiere of the feature doc I've just finished. The guy who's part of it, Jamin Hudson, stood up at the front and said, he said the problem is that opinions are like arseholes. Everybody's got one, and that the documentary was immensely hard to cut because there were so many opinions. But that's much more difficult to deal with than learning to use a different editing software.
Definitely.
And no matter how you did it, that would still have happened. So, and how on a kind of what you would, I don't know, you call it a political level, whatever you would call it. How as an editor do you deal with all these different people? Yeah. That's, unless you've kind of watched it or experienced it, you don't. That's much more difficult to explain to people, how to cope with a situation like that, rather than just standing up in a cutting room and telling everybody what to do with themselves, because that's a part of the skill levels that you need. And the problem with the industry that we have it at the moment is that, while the expansion is going on, you will have people who are immensely capable but don't have the as it were, the personal skills to go with the technical skills, because they've never had to deploy the personal skills at that server. And that's going to be an enormously steep learning curve for some people, I think. And
which is a shame, because you're usually very talented.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, exactly. These people, I'm always amazed at the capabilities of people coming out of the Screen Academy. They're only 20 odd, and you're thinking, oh, these people are really good at what they do, and they've absolutely dedicated to what they want to do.
I've said it before, I think we punch above our weight.
Oh, absolutely. I truly believe it. And I think that...
Well, coming from somewhere as like massive as London and then saying that about Perth is kind of a real feather in our cap.
But I think, you know, and I think that, but it's really come to the fore in the last sort of 10 years odd, where, you know, you talk about, Ryan, about making, you know, the Australian stories and all that sort of stuff, and that, and where I felt at the beginning there were not high expectations of the producers and the production companies for making high quality content, there is inevitably a sense that sometimes you can do stuff and get away with it. That's gone.
Yeah.
That's long gone now, and you can't. Because everybody has the same expectations now, because everything is this, it's a global industry. And that makes a big difference, a really big difference to what you need, you know, in terms of people producing screen content. And I think in editing particularly, the skills of an editor are now more needed than ever before because of the volume of stuff that's being shot for any given project, and the ability to find stories in it, and the ability to be detached from that and all that kind of stuff. So I think Perth will grow eventually into quite a big powerhouse in Australia, if not globally, for the industry. But it's just until then. Yeah, but I just don't think it's that far away. And also, the people like me, who are the kind of safe pair of hands people, are not going to be around forever. And when we vacate our seats, then people are going to have to say, okay, you know. It
is a longevity game, I found, especially between like your 20s and 40s in this industry, because it's so easy to want to let go and just go, I'm over this.
Yes. It's attrition. It really is attrition. I'll give you the last question.
Yeah.
But I want to ask one real quick. What's something that Ryan and I wouldn't know to ask you that you think we need to know?
God, that's really difficult. That's really.
That could be anything in life.
Yeah. I mean,
invest in stocks.
Don't do that.
No.
I think that probably it is actually about investment, and it's about investing in yourselves. And the fact of the matter is that it's. I don't think that you guys would necessarily think how long it's going to take you to break into the industry to be at the kind of level that I feel that I'm at the moment, which is fairly comfortable. I think that's the new norm. The new normal, with which we've had with all our, you know, stuff with COVID and all that sort of stuff. It's a weird expression, but I think it's going to take people. There are going to be very few people who kind of make these meteoric rises into the industry now. I think it's going to take a lot longer, simply because it's going to be much more difficult to establish the reputation you need. It really was a lot easier to establish your reputation 25 years ago than it is now, because you have to have skills across such a wide range of stuff, wide range of content, types of content. You'll be doing drama, you'll be doing documentary, you'll be doing stuff, you know, commercial stuff. I never had to worry about any of that. And I think that the question about how do I get into the industry is not the same question that it used to be. I really don't.
I'm going to end on something a little bit more positive, hopefully positive. What's the most rewarding thing you've found from following this career as an editor?
Well, I guess there are two things. One is, weirdly enough, the people you meet, and when you work with people and you work forging relationships with somebody that you sit next to every day for weeks on end in a kind of It's like a shotgun marriage, really. You get stuck with somebody, but I've never worked with anybody, no matter how young or how old or how experienced, that I haven't learned something of. And I think that's really important. That what I really like is the fact that I go into work every day and I'll come back with a piece of knowledge I didn't have the day before. And it will happen every single day. And it may be a shortcut on the software that somebody says, oh, did you know you could do this? To, oh, I've just solved a really difficult problem that I've been presented with in the editing. And I think that means that because it's an industry where, because it's a job particularly, not an industry, but a job where you can do that, sadly for you guys, it means that people like me stay on in it longer because it doesn't get stale. You know, if you work in an office, when you get to 60, you've had enough. You want to go and sit and do nothing in your garden in a deck chair. But I can't imagine not editing. I can't imagine what I would do with my days if I didn't cut stuff. And if I didn't get paid to edit for other people, I would be editing stuff unpaid for myself because I like doing it. And that, I think, geez, to have spent 40 years nearly in an industry where you've loved every minute of it, that's a big privilege. The number of people I've met who've had fantastic careers, and many of my childhood friends are now fabulously wealthy, but they've not enjoyed their life's work. And I'm neither fabulously wealthy or those, but I have, that I think is, this industry, it is a privilege to be in this industry because we all do it. It's like nursing, it's a vocation.
It sounds like a really cheesy thing, but I honestly reckon people start to click on that happiness is the new wealth.
Yeah, no, that's a very, that's very well put, because it is, because you go into work with a smile on your face, because one is lives are not at stake. You know, there's no such thing as a video emergency, is the byline of one of the people who's on the Avid forums, which I think is brilliant. Yeah. But also the other thing is that really, you know, if you can go into work and actually sit there and think, I'm really enjoying myself. And that happens day in and day out, week in and week out. And then suddenly you're 40. I mean, I'm too young to be in the industry for 40 years, aren't I? Yeah. No, I'm not.
Speaking of privilege, it's been an absolute privilege having you in.
Segue.
Nice. Very good. Master of segues. There we go. Good for something. John, thank you so much for coming.
It's been good fun, guys. Thank you very much indeed. Cheers.
Bart.